And we're live. Hi,
All right.
everyone. This is Sarah with Connect Our Elders, and I'm very excited today to have Dave Folz with us. He is the founder of Trust Counselor LLC, and he's a consultant to trustees and multi-generational families, basically advising them on what being a trustee is and how to do the job. So before we get started with the questions, Dave, would you mind sharing a bit about who you are and your background and how you came to create Trust Counselor?
Sure. I was in what I'm going to call the bank trust world for about 40 years. And after I, quote, retired, I was approached by a financial planner in town. And she said that the CEO of a family office was also the trustee, and he was very concerned about that role. Could I coach him for a while? And so we did that, and it worked out pretty well. And I started to think to myself, a lot of individual trustees really have no support other than calling the attorney at $500 or $1,000 an hour. And so I talked with several attorneys in town, and I said, if I started to do this, would there be need from your clients to have somebody kind of help them get started, and then ultimately to kind of be a trustee hotline, so whenever they had issues that weren't legal but more administrative, that they could call me and I could help them.
So you coached them through the process.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So this is interesting. Well, one thing that I've learned is that families often just make the assumption that one of their children wants to be the trustee, and oftentimes those adult children don't truly understand that, while it may seem like an honor, they don't realize that it is actually a part-time job in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So with the first question, when do most people find out that they're the trustee?
Well, that's a really good question. And an attorney friend of mine told me how some of his clients find out, unfortunately. But he said he was at a funeral, and after the funeral was over, he walked up to one of the children and said, "Can you tell me who Uncle Bob is?" And they said, "Well, he's over there." So he walked over and said, "Uncle Bob, I'd like to introduce myself. I was the attorney for your brother, and he named you trustee. Can we meet on Monday?" And the guy said, "Well, I'm a senior vice president at Texas Instruments. I'm going to be out of town all next week." And he said, "Well, this is really serious. There's some assets in the trust that need immediate attention." And he said, "Well, but I don't even know how to be a trustee."
What is a trustee, right?
Exactly. And that's how a lot of the conversation starts. What do I have to do? And, we start from there.
Okay. What does it mean to be a trustee?
Well, a trustee it's an important job. You have a trust document that you have to follow, but the person that created the trust is typically has died. And so the law creates higher responsibilities for you in handling those assets. So you have to follow the trust document, that's for sure. That's kind of your contract, if you will. But then there's also something called the trust code, and that gives additional instructions. But basically, you have to keep, there's a higher standard for the investments, and you have to pay attention to the terms of the trust as they affect the beneficiaries.
So is this what's called a fiduciary level responsibility?
Right. So fiduciary means it's a term that is defined in the dictionary and court and things like that. But it basically means you have to put the interest of the trust before your own interest. And so there's a lot of standards that go along with that. And that's kind of where I start with clients to go through the different duties that they have that may not be spelled out in the trust document.
Right. So somebody finds out that they're the trustee. Okay. What are the first steps that he or she should take, or the first steps?
Well, I think the first step is to read the trust. So a lot of it may not make any sense, but the first thing is to read the trust. And sometimes it's going to be 10 pages, which is lucky for you. Sometimes it's going to be 50 pages, and a lot of it is not going to make any sense at all because it's tax related. But give it a go, highlight questions that you might have. But then the next step, and it's really important, is to see either your attorney that you would like to hire to help you with this, or perhaps the attorney for the estate, the attorney that drafted the document.
Is there a reason to use the attorney that drafted the document, assuming that they're still alive?
Yeah.
Is there a reason why you would want to use that attorney versus engaging your own attorney to help you
Right.
sift through the
That's a
document?
good question. Typically, trustees will retain the attorney that drafted the document because it's assumed that he or she knows more about the assets, the terms of the trust, why the trust was created. They can help you with history, which your own attorney obviously couldn't help you with.
So if you could, I mean, it makes sense that you would work with the attorney if they're
Sure.
still alive to work
Sure.
through the trust.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when administering a trust as a trustee, what should they be paying attention to the most?
Well, I hate to say this, but it depends.
I knew that was going to be the answer. I had a feeling.
The two big ones really um, are kind of self-evident. The trust is going to own assets, and either that trust is created by somebody's will, and so they've died, and through probate, that trust gets assets, if you will, or this trust was created with assets in it, and then the individual who died was their own trustee, maybe, and then you're the successor. So there are assets in the trust, and they have to be managed. So that normally catches everybody's attention. I'm responsible for these, and the degree of responsibility is higher than you just managing your own assets. You can't go out and buy, in my opinion, Bitcoin or GameStop, two names that are really in the news right now. You have to be, I think, a little more conservative. You can still invest in all kinds of things, but there's a higher standard of care than just you managing your own money.
Okay, the fiduciary level that we
Right.
mentioned previously. Okay, so when it comes to the trust, and obviously, there's all these states and laws can vary, but when it comes to state trust laws, are
Right.
they the same?
Well, I think I'm just going to hazard a guess, but I think about 80%, maybe even 90% of trust laws, state to state, are the same. They're going to be slightly different, but a lot of the concepts are the same. There's the Uniform Prudent Investor Act, which talks about how trustees invest. There's the Uniform Principal and Income Act that talks about how when a stock pays a dividend, is that income or is that principal? Or if you get rent, what is that? But
Okay.
then there are differences. So to give you an example, here in Texas, you have to, if the beneficiary asks, you have to give them an annual accounting. And then they have 4 years to sue you if they think you did something wrong.
4 years.
4
Wow, I'm
years,
surprised by that.
it's a long time. Now, other states, and I don't remember whether it's Nevada or South Dakota, but it's only 120 days. So if you get a statement from a trustee in one of those states, you have 120 days to complain. So there's
Okay.
some nuances that are really important. So it's like I said, it's important to retain an attorney so you know what those kind of differences are.
Okay. So let's talk about the trust, right? Is this the situation where somebody passes away, mom or dad passes away, and all of a sudden you, there's no taxes, right? You just all that money's free and clear, or does the trust or the trustee have to pay taxes? And what kind
Well,
of taxes is it that they're having to pay?
that's a good question. There are different layers of taxation, if you will. If the trust is a large trust, and I'm going to say over $11 million, it's possible that federal estate taxes may come into play.
Okay.
So that's based on the value of the estate that would be over, let's say, $11 million, just in round numbers. It's possible the executor of the estate may have to pay those. Maybe the trust has to pay those, but that's a one-time event.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that there's another layer called generation skipping taxes that are on top of that, but that's kind of unusual most of the time. The ones you really have to pay attention to, though, are the income taxes that the trust pays. And
Okay.
without getting too complicated, you're going to have federal income taxes and you may have state income taxes. State income taxes would come into play generally, just generally speaking, where the trustee is a resident. So if your trustee is a Texas resident or a Florida resident, don't have to worry about it. If
Okay.
the trustee is a Louisiana resident, well, that's a bad example. If your trustee is a California resident, then you probably have to worry about California income taxes. Now, those are the general taxes, and when you come to actual taxation, a trust has to pay income tax like a taxpayer, like you and I have to pay taxes.
So it's its own entity, basically.
It
Its
is.
own.
It's its own entity.
Mhm.
And now the tax rate, you have to make a lot of money before you get up to 37%. A trust only has to get up to about 14,000, and then they pay 37%. But
37% at 14,000.
but but the trust gets a deduction for any income that it pays out to beneficiaries.
Okay.
So if the trust has $20,000 worth of income and pays it all out, then the trust doesn't have to pay any taxes at all. But then the beneficiary who gets that income has to pay taxes. So
You
it's
can't
really
hide from taxes, right? There's no hiding from taxes.
no
That's
way.
the moral of this. I'm
Now
realizing.
there's another moral of this too. A lot of times trustees think that if in January or February they give their tax information that they get from a brokerage firm or wherever, and they give it to their CPA, that they've done a good job. Well, taxes can get complex. And I think it's really important to involve the CPA early in the tax year, no later than August, and talk about what's in the trust and if there's any tax planning that can be done by the end of the year. Because after December 31, it's all over.
So I was curious about that because just like individuals will do tax planning or
Yes.
corporations, businesses. So you would do tax planning for a trust.
Right. And so
Okay.
sometimes you'll, if you have 2 or 3 beneficiaries, you might want to know what their income tax brackets are, because just kind of depending on what everybody's brackets are and what the trust bracket is, you may be able to make a difference.
There's a lot to consider. So how does it work? Let's say we have a trustee who doesn't know how to do the job, but also hasn't heard of you, doesn't seek counsel, and so then they don't pay the taxes. What happens in that situation?
Well, that's a great question. Well, you can go to Amazon and buy a book. And I always joke with my clients that there are about 8 books on Amazon on trust administration. Well, that sounds kind of interesting, but there are 15 books on corkscrew investing. Just kind of what are our priorities here? There's a very limited number of books available. And if you go to YouTube, there's actually some YouTube videos on being a trustee, but a lot of times they're very short. They're like 2 minutes or 8 minutes, then they're more commercial for an attorney or CPA to help you or to get hired.
Then there it is actual consulting and coaching them through the process. Okay. So if let's say I was the trustee, right? I just found out, and I literally don't know anything about investing.
Right.
So if I don't know anything about investments, can I hire someone to do that for me?
Sure. And I think it's probably a good idea. Now, the question is, who do you hire? And in general, there are what I'm going to call the old-fashioned stockbrokers, financial representatives. And they typically get paid on a commission basis. And then you have registered investment advisors who are paid like a 1% fee to manage money. Their standard is a little higher than the stockbroker standard in terms of how do you invest. So that's something that you might consider. Now, all that being said, there's some great financial representatives out there, stockbrokers, who do a wonderful job. So I'm not saying that that's not a good choice, but you really have to investigate who you're hiring. You're not responsible for whether the market goes up or down. You are responsible for reasonably choosing an investment advisor, making sure the asset allocation is appropriate, probably having an investment policy statement for the trust. That's kind of your responsibility.
So what I'm hearing is that the trustee, even if they're not going to be handling the investments themselves, but they decide to delegate that to an advisor, that they're ultimately still responsible for the decision that they made to choose that advisor, if for some reason that advisor ends up not doing a good job or doing
Well,
something shady is what I mean. The markets go up and down, but what I
yeah.
mean is that they end up, being shady.
Well, I'm not sure shady. I think the important thing is to continue to monitor the account.
Okay.
So, depending on the size of the trust, you might want to visit with the investment advisor quarterly or maybe annually, just kind of depending on what it's set up. But it's really important to document that you review the investments with your advisor and kind of keep track of that for sure.
So cover your back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. If I were to hire a stockbroker, do they need special credentials to manage trust investments?
Uh, I'm going to say generally not. Some states do have laws about registration, but I think probably they don't need any special requirements. But
Okay.
I still would think that, there's a higher degree of care for you as a trustee. So you probably want to be hiring somebody that's been out for maybe 10 years. You don't want to be
Mm-hmm.
hiring somebody that just got out of school, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want them learning on the trust money. You want them to have been around and had some experience. And, lawyers.
Perhaps experience with managing a trust,
Yeah,
somebody who has
good
experience with that.
question. Do you manage any trust money? And
Mm-hmm.
then everybody's required to do continuing education these days. Attorneys have hours, CPAs have hours, and in the investment world, there are certain hours. But you might ask about how much continuing education do you do? And can you tell me what kind of courses you've gone to in the last year?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So interview, right? Interview a
Yes.
few and see who's the right fit, who you can work well with, and then, of course, take into consideration experience as well.
Yes.
Okay. Can a trustee be paid? And if so, who gets to determine how much the trustee is paid?
That's a good question and one that comes up a lot in my practice. Sometimes that's the first question. How do I get paid?
Yeah. And this
Well,
is the one that makes families battle too, because usually, I'm on the elder care side. So that's,
yeah,
it starts getting quite tense between siblings sometimes.
that's right. Well, the first thing you do is look at the trust document, and the trust document may actually set a fee, although that's kind of unusual. Most documents will say the trustee is entitled to a reasonable fee.
Okay.
And trusts are kind of unique because it's up to you, the trustee, to determine what is reasonable. So there's
So it's not based on any state laws or precedent. It's really depending on what the family wants before they pass away.
right, generally not. Now there may be a few states out there that actually set a fee for trustees, but generally it's just a reasonable fee.
Okay.
And it in my coaching, I've got 12 different things we look at to see whether the fee is reasonable or not.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that you can do is look at what banks in your area charge. And then kind of based on what your responsibilities are, how complex or not complex,
Mm-hmm.
you might use that as kind of a base, either to take a lower fee or maybe even a higher fee. It just depends on how complex the trust is. And if
Mm-hmm.
you're paying somebody, if you're paying an investment advisor, then, your fee probably should be somewhat lower.
Can they also take into consideration, so not only how complex the trust is, but can they take into consideration, maybe some toxic family dynamics that make them carrying out their trustee responsibilities more time consuming, more draining?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those 12 things that I would look at.
Okay.
If you're in a litigious family, I mean, that's that's certainly a consideration. If you've got a beneficiary that sends you an email every day with another question, which in my world that happens,
Mm-hmm.
you might start out with one fee, but then at the end of the year, or maybe even not waiting that long, talk to the beneficiary and say, look, if you're going to send me an email every day on some question, then I'm going to have to charge more.
Right, basically charging for your time, what's your
Yes.
hourly rate in that case?
Yes.
Okay. So my understanding is that accounting has to be done on trusts each
Yes.
year. What exactly does that mean in accounting on the trust?
That's one that confuses all new trustees. So if you're in the business world, you may be familiar with what an accounting is. It's tracking expenses and it's tracking the investments. Most states have very specific line by line items in terms of what they want to see in the accounting. But if you think about it this way, the beneficiary really has no control over the trust other than by watching you, what you do. So what the
Hmm.
law wants you to do is to say, I'm starting with these assets at the beginning of the year. I've got this income, I've got this expense, I've paid out this in terms of distributions, I've paid this in taxes. At the end of the year, stock market's gone up or down, the value is here. I sold the family home. Everything that happened in the trust has to be accounted for. And so at the end of the year, you've got a balance.
Can
And
you
I would
hire someone to do that?
absolutely. So I would really recommend that whoever you're hiring to do the taxes, you also ask them to help you with the accounting.
Mhm. I would feel like, let's say if I ever end up being a trustee, if I were now, I would feel safer having somebody else do the accounting
Yeah,
versus trying to do it myself, you know?
yeah, yeah,
So that way the beneficiaries know that there's that checks and balances, there's that oversight.
right. And the other
Okay.
thing too, and I hate to say this, but sometimes trustees they'll be short of cash and they'll borrow money from the trust. You're not allowed to do that.
And they
um,
think, well, I'm gonna pay it back, but then that
they
doesn't
don't,
happen. It's like, well, I just need a little bit more. And then
right?
it adds up over time.
Or they sell the house and they buy it themselves. These are not things trustees are generally allowed to do. So by reporting everything during the course of the year, it does a great job keeping you on a straight and narrow.
Mm,
And the other thing all trustees should know is that if they ever get sued, the first thing that the attorney will ask for from the beneficiaries is, can I see the last accounting? Or can I see the
okay.
last three accountings? And trying to put those accountings together years after things have happened, who knows where the receipts are? Um, it's really, really hard. And
It feels like families, when they sit down to do the planning with their attorney, right, and they decide who they're going to choose as trustee, that they need to sit them down and put them through this course before the day comes. Because that person may say, thank you for considering me, but no, I really don't want this
yeah,
job.
well, and I've had
Or
some,
at least if they say yes to it, they'll have an idea of what they're heading into.
right. And I've had some clients say, "Will hire me." I mean, mom and dad are still alive. There's a bunch of money. They're going to create some trust before they die. And so mom and dad have kind of managed those trusts. This is kind of a long-term tax planning approach. But the kids are now 50 and they say, okay, it's time for you to be your own trustee. So I kind of step in and I spend an hour or 2 hours where I meet with them every quarter to kind of walk through what a trustee is supposed to do.
Oh, that's great. So that is a proactive approach. People are
Yes.
thinking that way. Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, no, that's
Wonderful.
a really good idea.
And I would think so. So my next question for you, are there courses, books, seminars that people can take to help them learn about being a trustee? And before you answer that, just it seems to me, just sitting there and reading about it would be so not as effective as having somebody like you hold their hand and actually guide them through it
Right.
all and being available to answer questions.
Well, there are some courses available. If you're in the bank trust world, you have access to these. But I mean, probably anybody could take them, but typically they're a week every year and it's $3,000. So think 3 weeks out of your life over 3 years and nine or $10,000. Plus you got to go out of town. Well, maybe not these days, but last year you had to go out of town in North Carolina or something like that. Um, there's an organization called the Independent Trustee Alliance that was created for trustees who are not banks. So if you just do a Google search under Independent Trustee Alliance, you'll come up with the website, and it's $150 a year. Uh, there is an annual conference where you can either go virtually or you can be there, and there'll be 8 or 9 topics that are important for trustees. And then sometimes during the course of the year, they'll have a coffee hour or a special seminar that you can go and learn about some aspect of being a trustee.
Is this for private fiduciaries as well as family members or friends that get appointed as the
Yeah,
trustee?
it's anybody is welcome to join.
Okay, that's
We
really,
have
really good
a
to
number
know.
of members in that group who are private trustees. They do this for a living, but
Hmm.
where you have other members who, they're a family trustee and they just want some source of education.
Okay, okay. I'm going to look into that. Okay, so somebody that gets appointed as the trustee, do they have to be licensed by a state to be the trustee? And then do they have to report to a court every year?
And these are good questions. And there is no universal rule. In California, if you are a trustee for pay, then there is a licensing process that you have to go through. That's not true in most states today, but sometimes California does kind of lead other states in things like this. So
Okay.
it's a possibility that we'll see more and more of that. And I think there's a few states, I'm not sure which ones they are. I haven't had to do this yet, but where if you're appointed under somebody's will, then you have to continue to report to the court annually.
And what do they do when they report to the court? Just
Well,
say, yes. Uh,
they have to present that annual accounting.
okay, okay,
But it's kind of unusual, but that's always a question to ask the attorney.
okay. This next question I'm really interested in hearing your response to. If my beneficiaries or the beneficiaries of the trustee have a spending problem, for example, they spend their monthly distribution before they get the next one, what should the trustee do?
That's a very hard question. Uh, every trustee every trust officer that's ever worked in a bank faces that on a regular basis.
A good friend of mine that works at Wells Fargo in the trust department, she's always talking about the phone calls she's fielding from, the beneficiaries.
Right. But not all beneficiaries are like that, let me assure you, but there are some that are. And the first thing that you try and do is work out a budget. But if they're spending money before the month is up, I mean, sometimes budgets don't make any sense to them mentally.
Right, right.
Sometimes, you can hire a financial planner to help them. And
Hmm.
sometimes that coaching that's different from you being a trustee, it's kind of a psychological thing, but the financial planner is their coach and they're trying to help them. Sometimes that works.
They have to work on their relationship with money,
Yes, yes. And there's
habits.
actually, there are licensed financial psychiatrists.
I
I
didn't
don't,
know that.
yeah, I just learned about that 2 or 3 months ago. I don't remember the name of the organization, but I guess if you do a Google search on financial psychiatrists, they're out there.
Fascinating. I had no idea. I was in a meeting this morning with somebody that was a money coach, and
Yeah,
I
well, it's
wasn't
kind of the same
sure,
thing.
that was kind of new to me. So to know that there's a financial psychiatrist, that's a whole new level. But it makes
Well,
sense because it really, if you have bad habits with money, it can wreck your life. It can wreck the life of others too.
oh,
So
absolutely.
it makes sense that there's, a mental health practitioner that focuses in that
Yeah.
area.
Well, and one other thought that, and this helps occasionally, is that there's if you do a Google search on TrueLink, that's a debit card. So what you do is that, let's just say that you're going to allocate $3,000 a month to the beneficiary.
Hmm.
So you would put $3,000 onto that debit card and they can use it like a credit card. And you can limit what they're allowed to buy with it. You might say that this is only good for food and pharmacy drugs. That's
Hmm.
it. You can't go to Home Depot and buy, I don't know, buy wood. You can't go to the liquor store and buy liquor. You can't go to a medical marijuana store and buy medical marijuana. Well, maybe you can. I don't know. But you can limit what that card can be used for.
This sounds especially useful for the situations where I'm just going to say, I'm not sure the appropriate way to say it, but, and I've had friends of mine that are fiduciaries or trust officers, and a child, right, in the family who's being taken care of by the trust has some sort of uh, disability, some sort of mental illness, and oftentimes, well, what I've seen anyway in my experience is that's coupled with, drug use or severe alcohol abuse, and so it sounds to me this card would be a good way to ensure that their distribution is being used on the things that the parent that was left wishes for the money to be used on,
Yeah, yeah,
food, shelter, bills, that sort of thing.
yeah.
Interesting. Okay. If the trustee cannot get along with the beneficiaries, does he or she have to talk to them?
Well, I guess um, in a sense, the legal answer is probably no, but you are, a lot of times trust will say, make distributions for the health, education, medical, and support needs of the beneficiary. So unless you're talking to the beneficiary, how are you going to know? So I think
True.
it's always good to meet with the beneficiary at least annually to be sure that their needs haven't changed.
Yes, I think that and this is kind of part of my world a little bit. So in that situation where it's just not going to work, it's too toxic, they can't communicate. Um, Oftentimes, a care manager, right, an independent care manager that's a
Yeah,
social worker or a nurse can fill that role, right, can be
yeah,
the extension, and then they can keep up to date with what's going on with the
yeah,
beneficiary, and then report back to the trustee
yeah,
and what's needed or what needs to change.
yeah.
I've actually seen that work out pretty well a lot. Okay. Can beneficiaries sue the trustee if they don't agree with the decisions?
Well, that's a good question. Um, if the trustee has done a proper job in terms of the investments, a reasonably good job, if the trustee has been paying attention to the needs of the beneficiary, and they've done the annual accounting, they can sue, but the likelihood that they would win is probably not great.
Does it
Benef-
still tie the trustee up in court and they end up having to
yeah,
spend a lot of money defending
yeah,
themselves regardless?
yeah. Plus, beneficiaries always have the benefit of hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
In Texas, they've got 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, unfortunately, that's just part of our legal system. Um, so, trustees have to be very conscious of what their responsibilities are.
If the trustee, if one of the beneficiaries decides to sue the trustee, can the trustee use funds from the trust to cover legal fees, or do they have to come out of their own pocket to defend themselves?
Well, that that's a really good question, and I think the answer is going to depend on the state that you're in.
Okay.
It's definitely a gray area. Even here in Texas, that's kind of a gray area. The better thing is probably to pay your own legal fees if you can first, and then when the litigation is over, and assuming that you win, then you have the trust reimburse you. That's the best way. But sometimes trustees just don't have the personal funds to pay their lawyers. So that's kind of where you get into a really gray area.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
I would say
All
it's
right.
generally not a good idea.
To do it right out of the trust account. But if they
Right.
win, then of course I mean, I
Yeah.
would think they deserve to be reimbursed for
Sure. Absolutely.
having to defend
Absolutely.
themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, if the trust owns property in another state, so let's say the trust is in Texas but owns property, or there's property in the trust from
Right.
California, does that present issues?
Yes. So if you have property in another state, if it's income producing, then you probably have some tax issues there. So if you have income producing real estate in California, I don't know for sure, but probably you're going to have to pay California income tax on the income from that property.
Okay.
If you have in Texas, it's not unusual for somebody to have a log cabin, like a place in Colorado in the mountains,
Mhm.
and that that's pretty easy. You just take title to it and there aren't any issues. But in some states, you actually would have to hire what's called an ancillary, an extra trustee to hold title to the property. So
Why?
well, that's what the law is.
I was supposed it's just the law. It just is what it is. Okay.
It's going to depend on the state. So um, I guess that's about all I can say is that
This came up in a meeting I was in a couple weeks ago. So let's say there's this couple, they've lived the majority of their lives in California. No, let's change the scenario. They've lived the majority of their lives in Pennsylvania, and then they decide as they get older, they decide to move to Florida.
yeah.
Now, when they do that, should they have the trust documents reviewed because they're moving to Florida? Because a lot of times they, once the documents are done, if they just sit there and nobody looks at them for 20 plus 30 years, what happens if they move state from Pennsylvania to Florida?
Well, that's in a sense, that's kind of an easy one because Florida has really their probate laws make it expensive and lengthy to go through a Florida probate. So a lot of people in Florida will put all their assets into a revocable trust. They're their own trustee while they're alive. They can change the trust anytime they want. But when they die, you don't have to go through probate because all the assets are in the trust. So that's a very common tool in Florida. I know it's a common tool in Ohio. I think it's a common tool in Oklahoma, Louisiana, California. In fact, if you're in California, I think just about every attorney is going to recommend a revocable trust. I don't know that for a fact, but very common.
I believe I'd have to double check, but I think it's if you have $150,000 in assets, right? That you go into probate unless it's in a trust.
Every state's going to be
in
different.
California. Yeah. Interesting. So David, what's a good situation? So those people in the audience listening, or, once I convert this into a YouTube and they watch the video, I mean, are you helping people all over the United States, or is it focused in Texas where you are? What are some when should people reach out to you?
Well, I kind of consider myself to be kind of a trustee hotline. So
Okay.
If there are general trust or administration issues, if they're in other states, it probably doesn't make that much difference. If there are some issues that seem to be unique, that might be impacted by state law, then either I'll see if I can find a quick answer, or it may be that I'm going to say, well, you need to go to a Pennsylvania attorney and get the answer to that.
Okay.
I have a legal background, but I don't practice law. I simply help with the administrative process for being a trustee.
Okay.
So if documents have to be drafted, releases have to be created because you're not in agreement with the beneficiaries and you kind of agree to handle something a certain way that may not fall under the trust document, and you need a release for that, an attorney has to do that. I can tell you need it, but an attorney has to prepare it.
You're the guide. You're the trustee guide.
Trustee hotline.
Okay, I like that. So how can people get in touch with you, Dave, if they want to learn more, if they have found themselves in this situation where they need your expertise and your guidance, how can they contact you?
Well, probably the easiest way is just to do a Google search under my name.
Okay.
And it's Folz, or you can do a Google search under Trust Counselor LLC, and that'll bring it up too. And I've got my email address and my phone number on my website.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate you being our guest today, and I hope we'll keep in touch. And I know for sure that this information was extremely useful and valuable to the audience. So thank you for joining. As a reminder, my name is Sarah. I'm the founder of Connect Our Elders. My entire intention is to empower the aging process. And I do that through education around elder care resources, navigation through those resources to help you figure out what the right solution is, and then, of course, ongoing advocacy to make sure that you get what you need and you're well taken care of. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Welcome.